Imagine a death so agonizing that history remembers it as the benchmark of absolute retribution. Molten silver is poured slowly and deliberately into the open eyes and ears of a screaming man. What we are witnessing is not a random flash of barbaric cruelty, but a calculated, bone-chilling sentence. This is how the 13th century punished the man whose greed triggered the gears of a continental apocalypse. The name of the condemned is Inalchuq Khan. He was the governor of Otrar, the man charged with guarding the eastern frontiers of the colossal Khwarezmian Empire. In the year 1218, an unusual army approached his stone walls. 450 merchant ambassadors and 500 camels, heavily laden with snow-white Chinese silk, sable furs, and gold ingots. The truth is a paradox. Genghis Khan, who had already conquered half of the Celestial Empire, had no desire to burn the Islamic world to the ground. The Lord of the East was seeking a trade partner, offering to share control over the Silk Road. But the arrogant official, looking down at the arrivals from his watchtower, did not see diplomats. Blinded by greed and convinced of his own impunity, the governor ordered the caravan slaughtered, hastily accusing the guests of espionage. It is commonly believed that world powers collapse only under the weight of global crises or the genius strategies of an enemy. However, today a different, frightening anatomy of a catastrophe will unfold before you. You will learn how the corruption of a single administrator, shielding himself behind his kinship with the ruling dynasty, provoked a war that wiped millions of people off the face of the earth. It will become clear how Genghis Khan's attempt to resolve the conflict peacefully was shattered against the arrogance of a sultan who made a fatal mistake. Why was the army of Khwarezm, numbering, if we believe the Persian chroniclers, 400,000 warriors, unable to stop a nomad force a third of its size? And how did the stolen metal in the basements of Otrar turn into a beacon that drew a steel avalanche upon them? Khan smugly counted someone else's wealth, anticipating a comfortable old age. Drunk on power, the bureaucrat genuinely believed that no one would dare challenge a giant state over a handful of butchered traitors. He was cruelly mistaken. An army that knew no mercy had already begun to move, setting out to grind the flourishing Khwarezm into dust and return the stolen silver to its new owner in the most sophisticated way possible. Dawn over Central Asia in the early 13th century illuminates the contours of a state that knows no equal. The dominions of the Khwarazm Shahs are spread out like a giant carpet from the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf. This colossal machine is operated by Sultan Muhammad II. Intoxicated by limitless power and a series of victories, he demands to be called a second Alexander the Great. Marching under his banners are troops numbering hundreds of thousands of warriors, a force exceeding the population of entire kingdoms in Europe. Surrounded by a sycophantic entourage and palace splendor, the Lord of the East believes the world has submissively frozen at his feet. Let us descend from the imperial heights to the northeastern frontiers of this superpower. Here, on the border with the Great Steppe, stands Otrar, the trading heart of the region and a crossroads of worlds. The city serves as more than just a transit hub. Protected by powerful fortifications and a network of irrigation canals, Otrar accumulates the wealth of the continent. The bazaars buzz in dozens of languages, the caravanserais are bursting with goods, and the massive walls give the residents an unshakable sense of confidence. The master of this border stronghold is appointed as Inalchuq, who has taken the title Khair Khan. The governor did not occupy this post thanks to military talent or wisdom. His power flows from blood. Inalchuq is a relative of the all-powerful Terken Khatun, the sultan's mother, who effectively heads the empire's shadow government. This connection to the ruling Kipchak elite turned an ordinary governor into an untouchable favorite. Relying on the military diaspora, Khair Khan robs merchants with impunity, rewrites laws, and revels in total permissiveness. Peering from the height of the watchtower into the dusty haze of the east, Inalchuq harbored a dangerous illusion. The governor genuinely believed that the endless steppe birthed only dirty barbarians. The nomads appeared to him as lawful prey, which a civilized official could outmaneuver without breaking a sweat. Pride prevented him from discerning a threat capable of grinding his world into powder. Reality was approaching with the inexorability of a tectonic shift. Beyond the rocky ridges, Genghis Khan had already turned tribal chaos into a perfect mechanism of destruction. The Mongol Tumans, having breached the Great Wall of China and crushed the Jin Empire, had become the most disciplined army on the planet. A tragic paradox arises. The arrogant governor considered himself the steel shield of civilization, not realizing that his own greed was already throwing the gates wide open to a continental catastrophe. The roots of such blind self-confidence lay in the internal structure of the state. Khwarezm, which seemed like a monolith, was rotting from dual power. Sultan Muhammad was trembling with fear of his own generals, who were loyal to his mother. Inalchuq used these political cracks with virtuosity. Understanding that the ruler would not risk contradicting Terken Khatun, the governor turned Otrar into his personal feeding trough. When the fear of justice disappears, its place is taken by greed that paralyzes reason. For centuries, the Silk Road remained the circulatory system of Eurasia. Ideas, spices, and life itself circulated through these arteries. The tracts connected parts of the world, granting prosperity to those who guaranteed order. But one day, this ancient mechanism suffered a fatal malfunction. The wind carries the dull ringing of bells. A huge caravan approaches the gates of Otrar. 450 ambassadors lead 500 animals loaded with sable, silver, and cotton. They arrived in peace, carrying a letter from the Shaker of the universe. But the glitter of these treasures under the scorching sun will eclipse the governor's mind. Blood on the market square will trigger a chain reaction that will incinerate a great empire, leaving only ash. Spring, the year 1200. The caravan, having overcome endless kilometers of grueling Asian steppes, heavily pulls into the gates of Otrar. The Great Silk Road, which for millennia has connected the two ends of the known world, pulses with wealth. A massive column of hundreds of people and an endless line of pack animals gradually fills the market square. The pack saddles literally groan under the weight of silver, Chinese cotton, and precious sable furs. Do not be deceived. This is not a random trading mission. Before us is an official embassy equipped by Genghis Khan himself and his generals under the Ortak system, partnership trade. The value of the cargo is comparable to the annual budget of an entire European country of that era. The governor, Inalchuq Khair Khan, has frozen atop the fortress wall. His gaze greedily absorbs the shine of ingots and expensive fabrics, assessing the scale of this foreign splendor. The governor's fingers convulsively grip the gilded handle of his dagger. In this very moment, a plan crystallizes in his consciousness that will soon cross out the fates of millions. Why did an experienced ruler commit this madness? The motive was not patriotism and not fear of spies, as he would claim later. Inalchuq was driven by pure, unrestrained greed, reinforced by a dangerous illusion of impunity. The governor genuinely believed that the Mongols were merely scattered savages, incapable of an organized response. He knew for certain, behind his back stood the indestructible army of the Khwarezm Shah, nearly 400,000 hardened warriors. This power exceeded the combined forces of all the Christian kings of Europe. Moreover, Inalchuq felt the protection of his formidable aunt, Terken Khatun, who held even the Sultan himself in fear. Hidden reality, however, promised death. The arriving merchants represented the financial interests of the highest Mongol elite, and the Lord of the East had already created the most ruthless military machine on the planet, one that had crushed the Jin Empire. A bitter historical paradox arises. Trying to enrich himself and demonstrate the superiority of civilization over dirty nomads, the ruler of Otrar single-handedly threw open the gates for the apocalypse, condemning his own people to extermination. The merchants, expecting hospitality, are suddenly surrounded by a dense ring of guards. The market square turns out to be tightly blocked. A methodical massacre begins. Unarmed ambassadors are hacked down with sabers, one by one. Hundreds of people fall into the hot dust. This is the largest destruction of a diplomatic mission in the history of the Middle Ages. The property of the murdered is instantly confiscated. The camels are led to the governor's stables, and the blood-stained silver is carried down into the basements of the Citadel. Otrar celebrates the plunder. Khan triumphs, reveling in his audacity. However, the executioners make a fatal blunder. One young camel driver manages to slip out of the cordon. Crazed with horror, the man flees into the endless desert. He carries with him neither silk nor gold. He carries a spark, capable of burning down a continent. Otrar washed itself in blood. But the real storm had not even been born on the eastern horizon. The stolen metal is locked in chests, and the governor sleeps peacefully. The official is convinced the incident is completely exhausted. No power would unleash a global war over a bunch of killed traitors. A few weeks will pass, and the escaped witness will fall at the feet of Genghis Khan with the terrible news. The shaker of the universe will learn of the death of his people and the defilement of his honor. An ordinary ruler of the steppe would have responded with a blind raid, but this man operates differently. He holds back his rage, choosing cold calculation. Before unleashing the dogs of war, Genghis Khan makes an unexpected move that will place the Khwarezm Shah before the most terrible choice of his life. Will Sultan Muhammad II be able to step over his pride to save the country? And why will a few singed hairs on the face of a Mongol ambassador cost the Islamic world millions of lives? The surviving driver, haunted and exhausted, overcomes thousands of kilometers of lifeless steppes. After weeks of grueling travel, the fugitive falls at the feet of the shaker of the universe, delivering the terrible news of the Otrar massacre. Unlike impulsive steppe chieftains, Genghis Khan suppresses his anger with icy calculation. The Khan does not need blind revenge. He requires absolute legal justification. He needs that specific casus belli, which will justify a total invasion before the face of heaven and his own people. A chain of fatal coincidences is set in motion. Muhammad II believed that the reprisal against the merchants would strengthen his authority and scare off foreigners. In reality, the Khwarezm Shah, without knowing it, handed the Mongol military machine the perfect excuse for the liquidation of his empire. Genghis Khan sends an official embassy to the ruler. 3 men, a Muslim named Ibn Khafraj Bughra, and 2 Mongols, carry an ultimatum. The demand sounds crystal clear. Hand over Inalchuq Khan for a public trial, thereby admitting the massacre was the mistake of a governor, not the will of the monarch. Let us transport ourselves to the throne room of Khwarezm. Amidst sycophantic nobles and steel-clad guards, Muhammad II listens to the envoys. The moment arrives that determines the future of civilization. The Sultan's decision, which doomed his dynasty, was a consequence of internal fear. Muhammad found himself a hostage of the system. Handing over Khan would mean an open conflict with his influential mother, Terken Khatun, and the Kipchak elite. Fearing his own generals more than the external threat, the ruler consciously chose the path to catastrophe. Here, Muhammad commits an act that tramples all diplomatic canons of the era. The head ambassador, the Muslim, is executed on the spot. The beards of the Mongols are singed off, a public humiliation equivalent to spitting in the face of the Khan himself. The mutilated men are driven out in disgrace. They will return to Genghis Khan's camp. The shorn hair falling onto the palace tiles will soon cost Asia millions of lives. Muhammad's senseless cruelty revealed not strength, but the deepest weakness. A man confident in his power does not assert himself at the expense of unarmed parliamentarians. A leader who compensates for internal trembling before his entourage with external tyranny inevitably leads the state to a cliff. Was Muhammad a proud sovereign or just a frightened captive of his own court? The Khwarezm Shah hoped he had demonstrated iron will. He did not yet understand. The era of negotiations had ended. The Lord of the East will not utter another word about peace. He will ascend the sacred mountain to ask the gods for blessing, for absolute, all-consuming revenge. The mutilated ambassadors returned to camp. The sight of the shorn beards and the news of the execution of the Muslim envoy plunged the Mongol court into shock. Steppe law states, an ambassador is inviolable, and such an insult is washed away only by blood. Any other ruler in Genghis Khan's place would have immediately flown into a rage and thrown his regiments into a frontal attack. But the Shaker of the universe chooses a different path. He leaves his tent in total solitude. Temujin heads toward the sacred mountain, Burkhan Khaldun. Having climbed to the very summit, the great conqueror begins an ancient shamanic ritual. The man before whom millions trembled humbly removes his Khan's hat. The chieftain unfastens his golden belt, the symbol of male pride, and submissively hangs it around his neck, likening himself to a simple slave before the face of a higher master. For 3 days and 3 nights, Genghis Khan prays to the eternal blue sky. Tears wash his face. In the silence of the mountain peaks, words are spoken that have forever entered the chronicles. I was not the instigator of this trouble. Grant me the strength for vengeance. Behind this long rite lies not just a religious impulse, but a brilliant political calculation. The commander faced not a local punitive operation, but a colossal campaign against the powerful Islamic world. He needed to turn the coming slaughter into a holy war. Having descended from Burkhan Khaldun, The ruler brought the army not just an order, he presented a mandate from heaven itself for the total destruction of Khwarezm. The picture changes with lightning speed. From the figure of a solitary old man, we move to a spectacle that makes the earth tremble. The largest mobilization of that era begins. Over 100,000 horsemen simultaneously break camp. This figure seems like dry statistics until you imagine the real volume. 100,000 warriors is the population of Paris and Venice of the 13th century combined. And all this enormous mass, bristling with steel, suddenly leaps into saddles and begins a coordinated movement to the west. Moreover, it is not a wild horde that enters the steppe, but a high-tech army that has absorbed the engineering genius of the Jin Empire. Behind the horse archers, wagons roll heavily with siege engines, gunpowder charges, and hundreds of Chinese master craftsmen. Here, a sinister irony is born. Inalchuq Khan, sitting in his palace, genuinely believed that deserts and mountain ranges would protect his domains. In reality, Genghis Khan used these obstacles as high-speed highways, turning frozen rivers into perfect roads. The arrogant governor waited for a raid of steppe ragamuffins, but approaching his gates was the most perfect machine of destruction in history. Autumn 1219. Having overcome the icy passes of the Altai, the steel avalanche of the Mongols approaches right up to the borders of Khwarezm. The first point on the map where this mechanism of revenge will trigger becomes precisely Otrar. The trap has snapped shut. The city is instantly cut off from the outside world. Inalchuq Khan stands motionless on the stone walls and peers into the dusty horizon, blackened by thousands of enemy horsetail standards. He no longer feels like an all-powerful aristocrat. Now he is prey cornered in a trap, realizing that this colossal army has traveled halfway across the world personally for his head. Winter 1219. Otrar, once flourishing at the crossroads of world trade routes, falls into a ring of steel. Chagatai and Ogaday tighten the noose of the siege around the border metropolis. An exhausting standoff begins, lasting nearly 6 months. This time was enough to completely empty the city granaries and turn the blooming center of Islamic civilization into an icy, starving tomb. Locked in a trap, Inalchuq Khan loses his illusions of his own greatness. The arrogant governor, who previously reveled in impunity, now fights with the fury of a doomed beast. He understands. Any other commander could be offered gold or service, but for the organizer of the massacre of the Khan's diplomats, mercy does not exist. However, the defense collapses not under the blows of battering rams, but because of internal betrayal. Sultan Muhammad II had earlier sent a 50,000-strong corps to Otrar under the command of General Caracha. Watching the melting forces of the defenders and the continuous hail of stone cannonballs, Qaracha makes a fatal decision. Under the cover of night, he leads troops out of the citadel and secretly opens the outer gates to the Mongol Tumens. Qaracha's betrayal exposed the fundamental abyss between the logic of the colliding worlds. The Khwarezmian commander counted on a generous reward for surrendering the fortress, unaware that the sons of Genghis Khan lived by the laws of the Yasa. In this harsh code, loyalty was recognized as the highest virtue, and treason against one's master as the worst crime. A paradox arises. Trying to save himself from the Mongol saber through betrayal, Qaracha signed his own death warrant. Chagatai and Ogaday look with contempt at the defector and order him executed immediately, along with all his officers, for violating their military oath. Having dealt with the traitors, the steel avalanche of nomads floods the streets of the city. Otrar has fallen, but Inalchuq, with a handful of bodyguards, retreats into the impregnable inner citadel, holding it for another whole month. Mongol engineers smash through the last heavy gates. The governor climbs higher and higher up the steps until he finds himself trapped on the roof of the highest tower. The hail of return arrows thins and goes quiet. The quivers are empty. The former ruler, accustomed to the luxury of silk and gold, desperately fights off enemies with fragments of baked clay. His wives, in terror, break bricks out of the parapet and pass them to their husband, who hurls them with a howl at the advancing helmets of the storming troops. The finale is inevitable. Genghis Khan ordered his sons to take the culprit of the slaughter exclusively alive. The bloodied, gasping governor is twisted down and shackled in heavy iron. The walls of Otrar have turned into smoking hills of rubble, but the Shaker of the universe did not need a dead prisoner who perished in the heat of battle. The Lord of the East required a living symbol of absolute justice. A reckoning is coming, the cruelty of which will make all Asia shudder. Spring, the year 1220. The impregnable walls of Otrar, the centuries-old shield of the Islamic world, have finally turned into piles of smoking rubble. 5 months of grueling siege and the desperate defense of the citadel concluded with the fall of the city. The surviving residents were ruthlessly exterminated or driven into slavery. Governor Inalchuq himself, shackled in heavy irons, is dragged out of the ruins. The gasping prisoner is delivered under convoy to the walls of Samarkand, straight to the camp of Genghis Khan. The climax of the continental tragedy arrives. The former ruler, accustomed to deciding the fates of thousands of people, falls powerlessly to his knees before the Lord of the East. Fate prepared the cruelest lesson for Inalchuq. The arrogant official genuinely believed that looted silks and silver ingots would buy him limitless power, and kinship with the Sultan's mother would ensure untouchability. However, the stolen metal acted as a beacon, attracting the most formidable army on the planet and triggering the mechanism of the empire's destruction. The very treasures for which he ruined unarmed diplomats are now turning into the instrument of his execution. Genghis Khan refuses a simple beheading. In the harsh coordinate system of the steppe, a quick death is too merciful an outcome for one who trampled the law on the inviolability of ambassadors. The conqueror turns retribution into a public and terrifying act of justice. The focus of events shifts sharply from the panorama of a destroyed state to a tiny patch of ground in front of the Khan's tent. A hot fire is stoked in the square. Coins and jewelry are thrown into a crucible, loot taken from the bodies of the murdered merchants of that very caravan. Metal, melted to 1,000 degrees, bubbles and radiates a blinding white glow. Guards throw the screaming Inalchuq to the ground, rigidly fixing his head. Molten silver is poured slowly, drop by drop, into the open eyes and ears of the governor. Behind this savage method lies a clear logic. Before us is not just a flash of rage, but a calibrated ideological message to all of Eurasia. Eyes that could not be satiated with wealth, and ears that remained deaf to the voice of reason, are now filled with deadly metal. A vast fortune did not bring the owner salvation. It took only a few ounces of boiling poison to forever extinguish the life of an official who imagined himself unpunishable. The merciless justice of the Great Steppe has been served. The Otrar massacre is avenged. However, the death of one man will no longer stop the global cataclysm. The steel avalanche that broke loose from the Altai continues its path to the west, grinding once blooming oases into dust. The ash of Otrar has long been scattered by the wind. The sophisticated execution of the governor has ended, serving merely as a bloody overture to a global cataclysm. The fall of the city exposes a ruthless law of history. No fortress strongholds and no legions of steel-clad warriors will save a power whose elite has lost the instinct for self-preservation. When the thirst for personal impunity outweighs the survival of the country, collapse becomes inevitable. The governor met his terrible finale fighting to the last breath. But where was his sovereign hiding? That same Muhammad II, who previously proudly wore the title of conqueror of the world and has now turned into a hunted fugitive sultan? In the next episode of the Wrath of God cycle, you will witness the most shameful flight in medieval chronicles. You will see how the ruler of half the world abandoned his own people to be torn apart and crossed the continent in panic, fleeing from two tireless dogs of war, Jebe and Subutai. We are to trace the path from the golden halls of Samarkand to the inglorious death of the monarch on a desolate Caspian island. Subscribe to the channel to witness with your own eyes the collapse of a colossus with feet of clay. See you in the corridors of real history.